She saw everyone ignore the mute son of the Mafia boss. He was a ghost in his own home, a silent, lonely boy trapped in a dangerous world of secrets and whispers. His powerful father loved him, but had given up hope, seeing only a broken child he could not fix. But the new housekeeper, a quiet, observant woman with a secret of her own, saw something no one else did. She saw the boy's hands moving, trying to speak a language the world had forgotten how to hear, until she did the one thing that was forbidden in that silent house. She spoke back. What happens when a humble housekeeper is the only one who holds the key to a silent boy's mind? And as she unlocks the dark secret of his past, will she become the one thing that can heal this broken family? Or will she become the next target of the dangerous world they live in? The Moretti villa was a fortress disguised as a paradise. It was a stunning, brutalist masterpiece of concrete and glass carved into the cliffs of Cabo Frio, its vast windows staring out at the impossibly blue Atlantic. Outside, the world was a riot of life, the crash of waves on white sand, the cry of gulls, the vibrant, irrepressible green of the spring foliage clinging to the rocks. Inside, it was silent. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of a tomb, a place where joy and spontaneity had long since been buried. On this bright Friday morning, Don Marco Moretti was holding court in his living room, a space so large and sparsely furnished it felt more like a modern art gallery than a home. He sat in a low leather armchair, a king on his throne, surrounded by his most trusted lieutenants. Their voices were low, their words coded, the conversation a quiet, menacing dance of power and business. At his side stood Rico, his second in command, his eyes sharp and watchful. In a corner of the vast room on a thick white rug sat the Don's 10-year-old son, Matteo. He was a small, pale boy with his father's dark, intense eyes. In front of him was a magnificent, intricate Lego city, a world of his own creation. He was completely, utterly invisible. The powerful, dangerous men in the room talked around him, their dark-suited forms moving past him as if he were just another piece of expensive, inanimate furniture. One of the younger men, nervous in the presence of the Don, shifted his weight and accidentally knocked a crystal glass of water from a side table. It shattered on the marble floor with a sound that was shockingly loud in the silent room. Matteo flinched violently. A tall, precarious tower on the edge of his Lego city toppled over, its small plastic bricks scattering across the rug. Don Marco's eyes flickered toward his son for a single irritated second, a flash of both annoyance at the disruption and a deeper, more painful frustration. Then, without a word of comfort or acknowledgement, he turned his attention back to his meeting, dismissing the boy entirely. No one looked at Matteo. No one moved to help him. After the men had gone, a heavy silence settled over the room once more. Don Marco, feeling a rare and uncomfortable pang of fatherly duty, walked over to where his son sat. He looked down at the intricate Lego city, a world of perfect, silent order. He wanted to say something, to connect, to breach the silent wall between them. But he was a man fluent only in the language of commands and consequences. He did not know the language of a father. "It's impressive, Matteo," he said finally, the words sounding clumsy and hollow in the vast space. Matteo did not look up. He did not acknowledge his father's presence in any way. With a slow, methodical focus, he simply began to rebuild the fallen tower, piece by silent piece. His silence was not empty. It was a fortress, and its walls were a mile high. Defeated, Don Marco sighed, a sound of profound, weary frustration. He turned and retreated to the cold sanctuary of his office, leaving his son alone once more. After the door clicked shut, Matteo stopped building. He looked up, through the vast glass walls of his castle, at the real world outside. He saw the colorful kites of the surfers dancing on the brilliant blue water. He saw a flock of bright green parakeets chatter and fly from a nearby tree. It was a world he could see, but one he could not speak to, one he was not a part of. He looked down at his own small, capable hands. He made a quick, complex, and frustrated gesture, a flick of the wrist, a curl of the fingers. It was a word. It was a sentence. It was a silent, desperate scream into the void. The silent prince was trapped in his glass castle, and he had long since given up hope that anyone would ever come who understood his language. Eliza arrived at the Moretti villa on a bright, sun-drenched Friday morning. The taxi wound its way up a steep private road, the brilliant blue of the Cabo Frio ocean on one side, a lush wall of vibrant spring green on the other. The villa itself was a modern fortress of concrete and glass, a stunning and intimidating structure that seemed to have been carved directly from the cliffside. It was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. The moment she stepped through the discreet staff entrance, however, the vibrant living world outside vanished. The air inside was cool, still and heavy, with a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. It smelled not of the salt and flowers from outside, but of lemon polish and a cold metallic emptiness. She was greeted by a senior formal housekeeper who gave her a brisk, impersonal tour. The rules were laid out with the precision of a military briefing. "You perform your duties quietly and efficiently," the woman said, her voice a low monotone. "You do not speak unless spoken to by a member of the family. You do not see anything you are not meant to see. You are, above all, discreet. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Eliza said. The message was clear: be invisible. As they passed through the main living area, a vast, minimalist space with a wall of glass overlooking the ocean, Eliza saw them for the first time. Don Marco Moretti was standing by the window, his back to them, speaking in a low, commanding rumble into his phone. He was a man who radiated an aura of pure, undisguised power. And in a far corner of the room, on a thick white rug, sat a small pale boy, meticulously constructing an elaborate city out of Lego bricks. He was the silent, lonely center of this grand, empty universe. Eliza's gaze was immediately and irrevocably drawn to the boy. The staff, the Don, the breathtaking view, it all faded away. She saw the profound, crushing loneliness that surrounded him like a bubble. She saw the incredible intelligence and focus in his small, capable hands as they assembled the tiny bricks. At one point, he looked up, his dark, intense eyes scanning the room for a fleeting second, and the look in them was not the look of a child. It was an ancient, weary sadness that made her own heart ache with a sudden, fierce empathy. Later that day, Eliza was assigned her first task, to dust the already spotless surfaces of the living room. She worked quietly, her movements graceful and unobtrusive, always keeping a respectful distance from the Don, who was now working at his large glass desk, and from the boy on the floor. As she worked, Matteo, the boy, let out a small, sharp sigh of frustration. A tiny, crucial Lego piece had slipped from his fingers and skittered under the enormous, low-slung sofa, well beyond his reach. He made a soft, guttural sound of annoyance, and his hands fluttered in a complex, angry gesture. The other staff in the room, polishing a far-off window, did not even glance in his direction. Don Marco did not look up from his work. The boy and his silent frustrations were, as always, invisible. But Eliza saw. Without a word, she put down her dustcloth. She walked over to the sofa, got down on her hands and knees, and peered into the shadows underneath. After a moment of searching, her hand emerged, holding the tiny grey plastic brick. She did not hand it to him, which might have felt like an intrusion. Instead, she walked over and placed it quietly on the edge of his Lego city, a silent offering. She didn't look at him. She didn't wait for a sign of thanks. She simply turned and went back to her dusting. But as she worked, she could feel his eyes on her. She could feel the weight of his stunned, curious gaze. For the first time since his mother had died, someone in this house had not only acknowledged his presence, but had understood a need without him having to make a sound. It was a tiny, simple act of kindness. But in the profound silence of Matteo Moretti's world, it was as loud and as resonant as a church bell. Perfetto siga. The small, silent connection that had formed between Eliza and Matteo was a delicate, invisible thread in the cold, tense atmosphere of the Moretti villa. For the next few days, Eliza felt the boy's eyes on her as she worked, his gaze a mixture of a deep, childish curiosity and a wary, hopeful assessment. He was watching her, waiting. The fragile peace was shattered on a Friday morning during a business lunch. Don Marco was hosting on the spectacular veranda overlooking the sea. The guests were not the usual high society types. They were a group of hard-faced, serious men, their expensive suits doing little to hide the cold, dangerous aura that surrounded them. At the head of the table, across from the Don, sat Rico, his second in command, a man with a watchful, predatory stillness. Matteo was there, as always, a silent fixture in the background. He was sitting on a lounge chair at the far end of the veranda, trying to lose himself in a book. But the conversation at the table, a low, menacing rumble of coded words about shipments, territories, and a problem that needed to be solved, was impossible to ignore. The air was thick with a tension that was different from the usual grief of the house. It was the sharp, metallic tension of imminent danger. Eliza, serving cool drinks, saw the change in Matteo. His small body was tense, his knuckles white where he gripped his book. He was listening, his perceptive, silent mind absorbing the dangerous undercurrents of the conversation. Then, one of the men made a low, cruel joke, and the group erupted in a short, harsh bark of laughter. The sound seemed to snap something in Matteo. He put his book down, he stood up, and in an act of incredible, desperate courage, he walked over to his father's chair and tugged firmly on the sleeve of his expensive suit jacket. Don Marco, annoyed at the interruption in front of his important associates, looked down at his son. "Matteo, what is it?" Matteo's face was a mask of frantic urgency. He began to gesture, his small hands a flurry of desperate, self-invented signs. He pointed at Rico, then made a quick slashing motion across his own throat. He pointed to his own chest, then made a shape like a snake with his hand, striking forward. He was trying, with every fiber of his being, to communicate a warning. He is a snake. He is a danger. The men at the table fell silent. They stared at the boy, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt for this broken, embarrassing display. Don Marco's face, which had been annoyed, now hardened into a mask of deep, public humiliation. His son was showing weakness in front of the very men who needed to see his strength. With a lightning-fast movement, he grabbed Matteo's small, flailing hands, stilling them. "Basta," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Enough, go to your room. Now." From the edge of the veranda, where she was standing with a tray, Eliza had seen it all. The other staff saw an embarrassing, incomprehensible tantrum. The lieutenant saw a defective air. The father saw a humiliating display of weakness. But Eliza, whose own life had been shaped by the beautiful, silent language of hands, saw something else entirely. She didn't understand the specific home-brewed signs, but she recognized the desperate grammar of a warning. She saw a brave boy trying to protect his father. She saw language where everyone else saw only madness. Crushed and utterly defeated, Matteo turned and fled, his silent retreat a final, unheard scream of frustration. The business lunch resumed, the awkward moment already dismissed, forgotten by everyone except Eliza. She stood in the shadows, her eyes fixed on the cold, ambitious face of Rico, the man Matteo had so desperately tried to identify as a threat. Then her gaze shifted to Don Marco, who was now laughing at a joke one of his men had just told, completely and blissfully unaware of the vital warning his son had just tried and failed to give him. She understood the true tragedy of this house then. It was not that the son was mute. It was that the father was blind. And in a world as dangerous as theirs, she knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that such blindness could be fatal. The night after the disastrous business lunch was a long and restless one for Eliza. She lay in her small, simple bed, the sounds of the ocean a distant, lonely whisper, her mind replaying the scene on the veranda over and over. She saw Matteo's frantic, desperate hands. She saw the flash of shame and anger on Don Marco's face. She heard his cold, dismissive command. She was a housekeeper. Her job was to be invisible, to see nothing, to say nothing, to intervene, to try and cross the vast, silent chasm that separated the Don from his son, would be an act of profound and possibly very dangerous insubordination. Every rational instinct told her to keep her head down, to do her job, and to forget what she had seen. But then she thought of her own little brother, deaf from birth, and the frustration and rage he would feel as a child when the hearing world refused to understand his beautiful, expressive language of hands. She thought of the loneliness of being a voice that no one could hear, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she could not, would not, do nothing. She found him the next morning. The house was quiet, Don Marco having already left for the day. She found Matteo in a secluded corner of the sprawling gardens, a quiet, sun-dappled sanctuary overlooking the sea that he had clearly claimed as his own. He was sitting on the edge of a small, decorative koi pond, listlessly tossing small pebbles into the water, his expression one of complete and utter dejection. He was a prince, defeated and exiled to the farthest corner of his own kingdom. Eliza approached him slowly, her footsteps soft on the grass so as not to startle him. She didn't carry a tray with a drink or use any other pretense for her presence. This was not an act of a housekeeper. This was a deliberate, intentional, and deeply personal act. She sat on the grass a few feet away from him. He did not look at her. He just continued his sad rhythmic task. Plink, plink, plink. She waited, her heart pounding, giving him the space and the silence he was used to. Then she took a breath and raised her hand, holding it in the space between them, where she knew he could see it in his peripheral vision. She made a single, simple, and universally understood sign. The index fingers of her two hands hooking together. Friend. The rhythmic tossing of pebbles stopped. Matteo froze, his small back ramrod straight. He turned his head, his movements so slow they were almost imperceptible. His dark, intense eyes stared, not at her face but at her hand, at the sign she was making. His own hands were clenched into small fists in his lap. His expression was one of absolute, stunned disbelief, mixed with a fragile, terrified, and dawning hope. He had lived his entire conscious life in a world where his hands were a source of frustration and shame, and now a stranger was using her own hands to speak to him in a language he could understand. He was hesitant. He was scared. To respond was to trust, and trust was a foreign country. But the desire to be heard, to be understood, was a force more powerful than his fear. Slowly, almost painfully, he lifted his own trembling hand. He watched hers, then copied the gesture, his own two small index fingers hooking together in a clumsy but unmistakable echo. Friend. Eliza's heart flooded with a profound, aching relief. A genuine, beautiful smile, the first one he had ever truly seen, spread across her face. She held his gaze, then her hands moved again, this time forming a new, gentle question. The fingertips of one hand, brushing down over her own cheek. Sad? He stared at her, at this incredible woman who had, in two simple, silent words, seen straight into the lonely, locked-up prison of his heart. And the walls he had so carefully built over years of silence and neglect finally, completely and irrevocably, crumbled. His small, pale face crumpled. His eyes filled with tears he had long since forgotten how to cry, and he gave a single sharp and heartbreaking nod. Yes. The day after their silent, tearful exchange in the garden, a new, secret current of energy began to flow through the Moretti villa. On the surface, nothing had changed. Eliza was still the quiet, efficient housekeeper. Matteo was still the silent, lonely son of the Don. But now, when they passed each other in the long marble hallways, they would share a brief, almost imperceptible glance. It was the secret handshake of a two-person club, a silent acknowledgement of the bridge that had been built between them. Eliza knew they needed a safe place, a sanctuary away from the cold, watchful eyes of the house. She found it at the far end of the sprawling cliffside property, a small, forgotten gazebo, half overgrown with a riot of brilliant pink bougainvillea. It was a private, sun-dappled world of its own. That afternoon, she left a small folded note on the edge of Matteo's Lego city. It had no words, only a simple, childish drawing of the gazebo. It was a secret invitation. He met her there an hour later, his expression a mixture of hope and a deep, nervous uncertainty. And so their lessons began. In their secret, sunlit classroom, the world began to open up for Matteo. Eliza became his teacher, his translator, his first and only true friend. She started with the basics, using the vibrant world around them. She would touch the leaf of a fern and slowly, carefully, make the sign for green. She would point to the vast, endless ocean and sign blue. He was a brilliant, ravenous student, his mind a thirsty sponge that soaked up this new, beautiful language. For the first time in his life, he had a way to label the world, to give names to the silent things he had only ever been able to see. Soon, they moved beyond simple words. She discovered the incredible sharp mind that had been trapped behind his silence. He had a quick, dry wit, and he began to make jokes, his small hands flashing with a newfound, joyful sarcasm. He would point to one of his father's stone-faced bodyguards and sign "Happy?" which made Eliza stifle a laugh. She brought books to their sanctuary, reading the stories aloud while her hands danced in the air, weaving a bridge between the written word, the spoken word, and his new, silent language. He, in turn, began to tell her his own stories. He told her about the intricate worlds he had built with his Legos, of the brave knights and the dragon-filled dungeons that had, until now, existed only in his own mind. Their bond moved from teacher and student to one of deep, trusting friendship one warm afternoon. A tiny, iridescent hummingbird, a jewel of emerald and ruby, hovered for a moment over a nearby flower. Matteo watched it, his eyes wide with wonder, and then he turned to Eliza. His hands moved, telling a story. Mommy loved hummingbirds. His expression turned sad. She called them flying jewels. Eliza's heart ached for him. She didn't offer empty pity. She simply signed back, her own movements slow and full of a gentle, poetic grace. She was right. They are music that you can see. He looked at her, and in his eyes was a look of such profound, grateful understanding. He knew in that moment that she didn't just understand his words, she understood his heart. They were so lost in their own beautiful private world that they did not notice the figure watching them from a distance. Rico, Don Marco's ambitious lieutenant, was taking a walk along the cliff path. He saw them in the gazebo, their heads close together, their hands moving in a silent, animated, and what looked to him deeply secret conversation. He saw the intense, happy focus on Matteo's face. He saw the easy, trusting affection between the Don's son and the new, invisible housekeeper. And his mind, a machine of paranoia and ambition, did not see a friendship. It saw a conspiracy. It saw a threat. A slow, cold suspicion settled in his heart. He would have to keep a much, much closer eye on this new woman. The chapter ended with a beautiful, dangerous contrast. In the sunlit gazebo, a boy's lonely world was finally, joyfully opening up, and in the shadows just beyond it, a new, dark and deadly threat was just beginning to take notice. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet, blossoming revolution for Matteo. His secret lessons with Eliza in the bougainvillea-draped gazebo were more than just an education. They were a lifeline. His world, once a tiny, silent prison, was now expanding with every new word, every new sign. His hands, which had once been clenched in frustration, were now eloquent and full of a life he had never been able to express. The change in the boy was subtle at first, but soon it became undeniable. The household staff noticed that his eyes were no longer perpetually downcast. They were now active, observant, and sometimes even held a flicker of amusement. He began to engage with the world in small, brave ways. One morning, as Don Marco was about to leave the villa for a series of tense meetings, Matteo approached him. He silently handed his father a small, perfectly folded piece of paper. Marco opened it. Inside was a single, meticulously drawn picture of a magnificent sailboat cutting through a brilliant blue sea. It was a gift, an act of communication. Marco was surprised and, for a moment, genuinely touched. He tucked the drawing into the pocket of his suit jacket, a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading in his chest. Later that day, his second-in-command, Rico, sat opposite him in his sterile, glass-walled office. "It is good to see young Matteo seem happier, Don Marco," Rico said, his voice a smooth, careful purr of feigned loyalty. "The new housekeeper, Eliza. She seems to be spending a great deal of time with him. They have become quite close." He paused, letting the implication settle. "It is unusual. The word, so simple and so perfectly chosen, was a drop of poison in the well of Marco's mind. Unusual. It took the strange, positive change in his son and reframed it as something to be suspected. His paternal warmth was immediately chilled by the paranoia of the Don. That evening, Marco did what he always did when he needed the unvarnished truth. He went to the security room, a dark, cold space in the heart of the villa where a bank of monitors displayed the silent, all-seeing eye of his camera system. He typed in a command, and the feed from the camera overlooking the far end of the garden appeared. The camera was distant, the figures small, but the image was perfectly clear. He saw his son and the housekeeper sitting together in the forgotten gazebo, and he saw their hands. They were moving. A rapid, complex, and completely silent conversation was flowing between them. He watched, mesmerized and deeply unsettled, as his son's hands danced in the air, his face animated with an emotion he had never seen before. And then, Matteo threw his head back and laughed. It was a silent, convulsive laugh, a gesture of pure, unadulterated joy that shook his entire small body. Marco's heart was suddenly at war with itself. The father in him, the grieving, broken man who loved his son more than life itself, felt a surge of overwhelming, breathtaking joy. His son was happy. His son was alive. He was talking. It was a miracle. But the Don, the man who had built an empire on a foundation of suspicion and who had survived in a world of treachery and secrets, felt a cold, different wave wash over him. A stranger, a quiet, invisible woman had forged a secret, private, and completely indecipherable line of communication with his son, his heir. What were they saying? What secrets about his life, his business, was she learning? In his world, a secret language was a weapon, and he had no idea if it was being aimed for him or against him. He sat there for a long time in the darkness of the security room, his face illuminated by the cool, blue-gray light of the screen. On the monitor was the beautiful, impossible image of his son, finally free, laughing in the warm spring sun. But the expression on Don Marco's face was not one of paternal joy. It was a mask of deep, profound, and dangerous conflict. He did not know if this woman was a saint or a serpent. He did not know if he was witnessing a miracle or a masterful infiltration. The only thing he knew for certain was that this quiet, unassuming housekeeper had just become the most important and potentially the most dangerous person in his entire world. The morning after Don Marco Moretti had spied on his own son, a new and dangerous tension settled over the glass castle. On the surface, things appeared to be a miraculous new normal. For the first time, Matteo joined his father at the breakfast table on the sun-drenched veranda. He was still silent, but he was present. He used a simple sign, 2 fingers to his lips, to ask for a drink, and Eliza, sitting with them, had calmly translated for a still-learning Marco. It was a picture of a healing family, but Marco was not seeing it with the eyes of a father. He was seeing it with the eyes of the Don. He watched the easy, silent communication that flowed between his son and the housekeeper, the shared glances, the small smiles. It was a private, coded world, and he was on the outside of it, and it made him deeply, profoundly suspicious. After breakfast, he summoned his second-in-command to his study. The room was cold, a stark, minimalist space designed for business, not for family. "The new housekeeper, Eliza," Marco began, his voice as flat and as cold as the polished concrete floor. "She has developed a unique relationship with my son. I find it interesting." Rico stood before the desk, his expression a perfect mask of loyal obedience. "Yes, Don Marco, it is good to see the boy seems happier." "Happiness is a luxury," Marco said, his eyes narrowing. "Information is a necessity. I want to know everything about her, where she came from, who her family is. I want to know where a simple housekeeper learned a secret language, every job she's ever had, every place she's ever lived. I want to know who, precisely, I have living under my roof." He looked at Rico, his command absolute. "Be discreet, but be thorough. I want answers by the end of the week." "Of course, Don Marco," Rico said with a small, respectful bow. Inside, he was triumphant. The Don had taken the bait. This was his chance to find something, or if necessary to invent something that would remove this woman from the board for good. While this dark, secret investigation was being set in motion, a scene of pure, innocent connection was unfolding in the quiet sanctuary of the gazebo. Eliza was teaching Matteo a new sign. She placed one hand over the other, as if covering her heart. "Trust," she signed. "It means you believe someone will keep you safe, that they will not hurt you." Matteo watched her, his expression serious. He then pointed to her, and then made the sign for trust himself. "I trust you." Eliza's heart flooded with a warmth so powerful, it almost brought tears to her eyes. In the middle of this cold, dangerous house, this small, silent boy had given her the most precious gift he possessed. The day ended with a terrible, poignant contrast. In the sunlit garden, Eliza and Matteo sat together, their hands moving, weaving a beautiful, silent world of shared stories and absolute, innocent trust. And in a dark, anonymous office in the city, Rico was making a phone call to a shady contact, putting the ruthless, efficient machinery of the Moretti organization to work. His mission, to dig into the life of that same woman, to find a weakness, a flaw, a secret that he could use to destroy her. From his study window, Marco watched his son in the garden. He saw the boy's animated, happy face. He saw him laughing, a silent, joyful laugh. The father in him felt a surge of profound relief. But the Don in him was still whispering of conspiracies and threats. Is this protection, he asked himself, his heart a battlefield? Or is this just another way of being blind? The investigation had begun, and the beautiful secret world that was healing his son was now officially under threat. The week of the secret investigation was a quiet torment for Don Marco Moretti. He watched his son, a boy who was now filled with a new, vibrant life, a light that was undeniably lit by Eliza. He would see Matteo in the garden with her, his hands flying as he told a silent story, his face animated with a joy Marco had thought was lost forever. The father in him would feel a surge of profound, overwhelming gratitude. But then the Don would reassert control. He would retreat to the cold darkness of his security room and watch them, his mind a cauldron of suspicion and paranoia. What were they saying? What secrets were they sharing? His Lieutenant Rico was right. It was unusual. On Friday morning, Rico arrived at the villa to deliver his report in person. He entered Marco's study, his expression a carefully constructed mask of grim, loyal duty. Marco's heart tightened. He steeled himself for the worst. "Well?" Marco asked, his voice a low growl. Rico placed a thin folder on the polished desk. He looked to Marco's surprise, disappointed. "She's a ghost, Don Marco," he began. "But a clean one." He laid it out. The investigation had been ruthlessly thorough, and it had found nothing. Her name was Eliza May. She had grown up in a small rural town in the quiet countryside. Her family was simple, unremarkable. A mechanic father, a schoolteacher mother. "The sign language," Rico continued, "it comes from her younger brother. He was born deaf. He passed away from a childhood illness when he was 10. She was his primary means of communication with the world." The report went on. Her record was spotless. No crimes, no debts, no questionable associations. After her brother died, she had worked for 5 years as a live-in caregiver for an elderly, wealthy woman until the woman had passed away. The references from that position were not just good. They were glowing, filled with praise for her kindness, her patience, and her profound integrity. "She is," Rico finished, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "exactly who she appears to be. A quiet, decent woman with a sad past." Marco stared at the report, a wave of profound, dizzying relief washing over him. The father in him had won. She was good. She was real. But Rico, the master manipulator, could not accept defeat. He saw the relief on Marco's face and made one last desperate attempt to stoke the fires of his paranoia. "It's too clean, Don Marco," he insisted, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "Nobody is this perfect. It feels like a story, a legend created for her." A woman with this background, this unique skill, to just happen to appear here. It feels like a plan. What if a rival family found her? What if they are using her tragic story, her secret language, as the perfect tool to get inside? Marco listened to the familiar poisonous whisper of his own world, the world where everyone had an angle, where every kindness was a potential betrayal. The Don in him acknowledged the cold logic of Rico's paranoia. But then he thought of the pure, uncomplicated joy on his son's face. He thought of the simple drawing of a sailboat in his pocket. He was tired, so tired of living in the shadows, of suspecting everyone, of seeing the world as a constant looming threat. For the first time, he chose to believe in the simple goodness he saw every day with his own eyes. The father finally won the war. He stood up, the movement a clear, final dismissal. His voice was as cold and as hard as the glass walls of his office. "The investigation is over, Rico. She is clean. You will leave her alone. You will not watch her. You will not follow her. You will not speak of her again unless it is with the respect due to a member of this household." He looked Rico directly in the eye. "She is under my protection. Is that understood?" A flicker of pure, cold fury passed through Rico's eyes before being masked by a look of perfect, loyal obedience. "Understood, Don Marco." Rico was dismissed, his face a mask of barely concealed rage. He had been thwarted. His attempt to use the Don's own paranoia had failed. He now knew that if he wanted this woman gone, he would have to handle it himself. Later that day, Marco walked out into the sunlit garden. He had the clean report in his hand, a document that felt like a certificate of his own absolution. He watched his son and Eliza, their hands dancing in the air as they talked about a flower. He had made a leap of faith. He had chosen to trust. He also knew with a chilling certainty that by giving Rico a direct, absolute order to stand down, he had not ended a threat. He had only made it more personal and far more dangerous. The moment Don Marco Moretti declared Eliza to be under his protection, the entire atmosphere of the glass castle shifted. The secret, whispered conversations in the gazebo moved out into the open, onto the sun-drenched veranda and into the bright, airy living room. The cloud of suspicion that had hung over Eliza lifted completely, replaced by a new, sanctioned sense of purpose. Her job was no longer just to be a housekeeper, it was to be the bridge to Matteo. And with that bridge now officially open for traffic, Matteo began to cross it. The change in the boy was a quiet, then a glorious unfolding. His personality, which had been locked away for years behind a wall of silence, began to emerge piece by brilliant piece. The household staff, who had for so long treated him with a mixture of fear and pity, began to see him as a person. One morning, as the chef was preparing breakfast, Matteo, with Eliza at his side, signed a complex question about the spices being used. The chef looked at Eliza, but she just smiled. "He's asking you, not me," she said gently. Haltingly at first, the chef began to explain the ingredients directly to the boy, and a new tentative conversation began in the heart of the home. His private tutor was astounded. The sullen, passive student who would barely nod was gone. In his place was a sharp, inquisitive and challenging young mind. With Eliza sitting in on his lessons to act as his translator, Matteo would fill a whiteboard with complex equations, debate points of history, and ask questions so insightful they often left the tutor speechless. His brilliant mind, once his most private sanctuary, was now on full display. And with his new voice he revealed a sharp and observant wit. One afternoon, he saw the ever-serious Rico walking stiffly across the lawn. Matteo caught Eliza's eye, and his hands moved in a quick, secret joke just for her. Snake, wares, nice, shoes. Eliza had to turn away to hide her sudden burst of laughter. The most profound blossoming, however, was in his relationship with his father. Marco, true to his new resolve, had begun to learn sign language, his large, powerful hands often clumsy and slow, but his effort was sincere and unwavering. One afternoon he came to the living room where Matteo was working on his magnificent Lego city. In the past, Marco would have stood awkwardly for a moment before retreating. Today he sat down on the floor. Using the simple signs he had learned, he asked, "Tell me story." For a moment, Matteo just stared. Then, a brilliant, excited light filled his eyes. With his hands flying, and with Eliza occasionally leaning in to translate a more complex sign, he began the tour. He explained the entire world he had created: the towering skyscrapers, the secret escape tunnels, the brave knights who guarded the city gates, and the evil sorcerer who lived in the dark tower at the edge. He was sharing his entire complex and vibrant inner world with his father for the very first time. When the tour was over, Matteo paused. He then carefully picked up a single Lego figure, the one with a small plastic crown and cape, the king of his entire city. He held it out to his father. It was a profound, symbolic gesture of trust, an offering of the keys to his kingdom. Marco accepted the small plastic figure as if it were the most precious jewel in the world, his heart aching with a love so deep it was almost painful. He looked at his son, who was now eagerly showing him the castle's dungeon. He realized that for years, in his grief and frustration, he had been trying to force his son to enter his world, a world of spoken words, of power, of grim, adult realities. He understood now that his true job as a father was to have the humility and the love to enter his son's world first. And in this world, he was not a don, not a boss, not a man to be feared. He was just a dad, on the floor, learning a new, beautiful language, one Lego brick at a time. The don was at war with the father, and the father, for the first time in a very long time, was winning. In the week that followed Marco's decision to trust Eliza, his old habits fought a losing battle with his new reality. He would still, on occasion, find himself in the dark security room, the cold instinct of a lifetime of paranoia drawing him there. He would watch the feeds, looking for a threat, a sign of deceit. But what he saw, day after day, was not a conspiracy. It was a quiet, steady, and beautiful miracle. He watched from the cold blue light of his monitors as his home was transformed. He saw Eliza and Matteo in the kitchen, not just communicating, but laughing, their hands a blur of shared jokes he didn't understand, but whose joy was unmistakable. He saw them in the garden, where Eliza was teaching his son not just the names of the flowers in sign language, but their scents, their textures, their very souls. The most profound shift, however, was in his own study. On a bright Friday morning, Marco was on a series of tense international video calls, his world a familiar landscape of numbers, threats, and strategic maneuvers. But his focus was not on the screen. It was on the scene unfolding on the sun-drenched veranda just outside his glass wall. Eliza was conducting a history lesson with Matteo. His son, who had once endured his tutors with a sullen, resentful silence, was now an active, engaged participant. He sat straight and tall in his chair, his eyes bright with interest, his hands moving as he debated a point with Eliza about the Roman Empire. At one point, a magnificent iridescent blue morpho butterfly, a jewel of the Brazilian spring, landed on a hibiscus flower near their table. Eliza paused the lesson. The two of them, the woman and the boy, simply sat in a shared, reverent silence, watching the beautiful creature gently fan its wings. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated presence, of finding a quiet wonder in the middle of a normal day. And Marco, a man who had spent his entire life in a frantic, relentless rush from one deal to the next, a man who never paused to simply be, felt a profound and unfamiliar ache in his chest. He realized that this incredible woman was teaching his son more than just a language, more than history. She was teaching him a skill that Marco himself had never learned: how to find a quiet, simple joy in the small, beautiful moments of life. His feelings for her, which had been a confusing, chaotic mixture of suspicion, gratitude, and a grudging respect, began to crystallize into something new, something warm, something deeply, personally, and dangerously close to affection. He was not just grateful for what she was doing for his son. He was becoming utterly captivated by the woman she was. The video call on his screen ended. His business partners in another time zone were waiting. He simply closed the laptop. That evening, after Matteo was asleep, he walked out onto the veranda. Eliza and Matteo were long since gone, but the history book was still sitting on the table, left open to a chapter on Roman aqueducts. He picked it up. Tucked carefully between the pages, as a bookmark, was a single, perfect and impossibly blue butterfly wing. He held the delicate, fragile object in the palm of his hand. He understood then that this woman, whom he had once seen as a potential threat to his empire, was actually a quiet, gentle threat to the cold, empty fortress he had built around his own heart. His watchful eye was no longer that of a paranoid don. It was that of a man who was, against all his better judgment, beginning to fall in love. Rico, Don Marco Moretti's second-in-command, had risen through the ranks on the strength of a single, invaluable skill. He was a master observer of power. He understood its secret currents, its subtle shifts, and its quiet, brutal transactions. And as he arrived at the Moretti villa on a brilliant Friday morning for his weekly meeting with the Don, he sensed that the very ground beneath his feet was shifting. His first clue was the sound. The house, which for years had been a tomb of tense, masculine silence, was now filled with the faint, distant sound of a child's happy, chattering laughter. He followed the sound to the grand veranda, and there he saw it, the scene that confirmed his deepest fears. The three of them were having a late breakfast together in the warm spring sun. It was not a formal meal, it was a family. Marco was not the grim, distant Don. He was a father, a relaxed smile on his face as he laughed at something his son had just signed. The boy, Matteo, was no longer a silent ghost. He was a vibrant, expressive child, his hands and face alight with a newfound confidence. And at the center of it all was her, Eliza, the quiet housekeeper. She was not standing in the background. She was sitting at the table, a part of the circle, a look of easy, maternal affection on her face. Rico watched from the shadows of the hallway, and he analyzed the scene with the cold, detached precision of a general studying a battlefield. He did not see a healing family. He saw a catastrophic shift in the balance of power. He saw Matteo, the boy he had always written off as a broken, tragic liability, now transforming into a true heir, a boy who was finding his voice, his strength, and his father's complete and utter devotion. A strong heir, Rico knew, was a complication to his own long-term ambitions. And he saw Eliza, the invisible woman, who had somehow become the architect of this transformation. She was the source of the boy's new strength. More than that, she was the source of the Don's new, softer, and in Rico's opinion, weaker disposition. She had the Don's ear. She had his trust. And judging by the warm, lingering way Marco's eyes rested on her, she was well on her way to having his heart. In Rico's world, a woman with that much influence over the boss was a queen, and she was a queen he did not control. His meeting with Marco an hour later only confirmed his fears. The Don was distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere. He cut the meeting short, something he had never done before, saying he had promised to help Matteo with a school project. Rico left the villa, his mind racing. He walked along the cliffside path, the brilliant blue ocean churning below, his own thoughts just as turbulent. His first subtle attempt to use the Don's own paranoia against Eliza had failed spectacularly. Marco had declared her under his protection. That meant the official machinery of the Moretti organization could not be used against her. He stopped and looked back at the magnificent glass castle on the cliff. It was a kingdom he had spent his entire adult life patiently working to one day inherit or control. And that quiet, gentle woman was a direct existential threat to his entire future. A cold, determined smile touched his lips. The situation required a new, more direct strategy. He could no longer rely on the Don's suspicion. He would have to act alone. He would have to give his boss a reason to cut her out. A reason that had nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with the one law that ruled their world, loyalty. He needed to prove that she was not a healer. He needed to prove that she was a traitor. The housekeeper had made herself a queen. It was now his job, he decided, to remove her from the board. Permanently. With Marco's trust as their shield, the secret lessons between Eliza and Matteo blossomed into the central, joyful rhythm of their lives. The fear of being discovered was gone, replaced by an easy, open, and profound friendship. Their sanctuary, the bougainvillea-covered gazebo, was no longer just a classroom, it was a world of their own. They had moved far beyond simple vocabulary. They were now learning the nuances of the language, the grammar of emotion, the poetry of the hands. One bright late spring morning, as the warm Cabo Frio sun danced on the water below, Matteo, with his newfound confidence, asked a question he had been wanting to ask for weeks. His hands moved with a new, fluid grace. "Who? Teach? You?" Eliza paused, her own hands still in her lap. This was the key to the most guarded room in her own heart, a story she had not told anyone in a very, very long time. But as she looked at Matteo's curious, intelligent, and completely trusting face, she knew he had earned the truth. She began to sign, her movements slower now, imbued with the weight of a cherished, painful memory. "I had a brother," she signed. "His name was Daniel. He was younger than me. He was born into a world of silence. He was deaf." She told him everything. She told him of the frustration of her early childhood, of loving her little brother so fiercely, but being unable to cross the frustrating, silent chasm between them. She described the magical day their parents had brought home a teacher, and the whole family had begun to learn this new, beautiful, secret language together. It was like a key, she explained, her hands painting a picture for him. It unlocked him. It unlocked us. I remember the first time we had a real conversation. We talked for hours, our hands flying. We talked about silly things, about his favorite color, about a dream I'd had. For the first time, I wasn't just his big sister. I was his friend. Matteo watched, his own eyes wide, completely captivated, understanding the profound joy of a silence finally being broken. Eliza's hands then slowed, her expression turning sad. "He got sick," she signed, the simple words carrying a universe of pain. "When he was 10, the same age as you. And then he was gone." She looked down at her own hands. "After that, I had no one to sign with. My hands, they felt so lonely." Matteo listened, his own heart aching with a profound, quiet empathy. He understood, in a way no one else in this house ever could, what it felt like to have a voice that was trapped, to have hands that wanted to speak but had no one to listen. And then, this small, silent boy did something extraordinary. He reached across the space between them and gently, hesitantly took one of her hands in his own. He looked her directly in the eye, and with his other hand he signed, slowly and with perfect, deliberate clarity. "Hands. Not. Lonely. Now." He then added two more signs, a simple, profound promise. "I. Listen." The simple, powerful act of comfort from the very boy she had been so determined to heal completely shattered her composure. She had been strong for so long, a quiet, steady pillar for this broken family, but his small, kind gesture had found the cracks in her own carefully guarded heart. A sob escaped her, and for the first time in front of him, she cried. Not the silent, hopeless tears of her past, but tears of a deep, cathartic and grateful emotional release. Matteo did not pull away. He simply moved closer on the bench and, with a tentative, gentle motion, began to pat her shoulder. A small, silent boy, comforting the woman who had saved him. Their bond, in that moment, was sealed. It was no longer just a friendship between a caregiver and a child. It was a deep soul-level connection between two people who understood the sacred, silent language of loss, and who were now together, teaching each other a new and even more beautiful language for joy. A few nights later, Don Marco was away on an overnight business trip, and a deep, peaceful quiet had settled over the great house. Eliza was in her room reading, the only sound the distant, rhythmic whisper of the ocean. It was the kind of peace she had come to cherish, a fragile but beautiful thing. The peace was shattered just after midnight. She was jolted from a light sleep not by a scream, but by a series of soft, rhythmic, and deeply unsettling thuds coming from down the hall. From Matteo's room. She was out of her bed in an instant, her heart pounding. She rushed to his room and pushed the door open. The scene inside was terrifying. Matteo was in the grip of a violent night terror. His eyes were wide open, staring at some unseen horror. But he was not awake. He was thrashing in his bed, his body rigid, his small heels kicking a frantic, desperate rhythm against the heavy wooden headboard, creating the terrible, thudding sound she had heard. He was making no sound, but his entire body was a silent, desperate scream. And his hands, his beautiful, expressive hands, were not communicating. They were flailing, making broken, panicked, and disjointed signs that spoke of pure, unadulterated terror. Eliza knew from her experience with her brother that waking him suddenly would be a mistake. This was a trauma response, a memory replaying itself. She didn't try to restrain him. She sat on the edge of his bed, took one of his flailing hands in both of hers, and held it firmly but gently. She began to sign a single, simple, grounding word, over and over, pressing the sign into his palm so he could feel it. Safe. You are safe. I am here. You are safe. Slowly, like a ship turning in a storm, her touch and the familiar, steady rhythm of the sign began to pierce through the chaos of his terror. His thrashing lessened. The wild, unseeing look in his eyes began to soften, to focus. He was coming back. He blinked, and then he saw her, a calm, steady anchor in his nightmare. He was awake now, but the horror of the dream was still clinging to him. He was trembling violently, tears streaming silently down his pale cheeks. He looked at Eliza, his hands still shaking, and he began to tell her what he had seen. His signs were frantic, broken, the grammar of a mind still in the grip of terror. Eliza had to piece them together, her own heart pounding in her chest as she deciphered the horrifying story. She saw the signs for car, fast, then mommy, face, afraid. Then a quick, sharp sign for loud, followed by a gesture for metal, and then his hands exploding outward in a sign for broken glass, and then the most terrifying sign of all. He signed the word red, and then, with a trembling finger, he drew a slow, dripping line down the side of his own face, a silent, terrible image of something wet and red, like rain running down a window. The story was told. The fragmented, terrible memory was out. He collapsed against her, his body racked with great shuddering and finally audible sobs, the first real sounds of grief she had ever heard him make. She just held him, rocking him gently, her own heart breaking for him, murmuring soft words of comfort until his sobs subsided into the quiet, ragged breaths of a deep and exhausted sleep. Long after he was asleep, Eliza remained, sitting in the darkness, watching over the boy who had just entrusted her with his soul. The house was silent again, but this silence was different. It was now filled with a terrible, dangerous knowledge. She had just become the sole keeper of the most explosive secret in the Moretti family. She now understood that Matteo's silence was not a condition. It was a cage, a fortress he had built to hold back a memory so horrific he couldn't bear to speak its name. And she knew with a chilling, absolute certainty that the official story of his mother's death, whatever it was not the full truth. The real truth was locked away in this little boy's mind. And she was the only person in the world who had just been given the key. The morning after the nightmare was heavy, with a fragile, unspoken truth. Matteo was subdued, a quiet shadow who clung to Eliza's hand, his eyes wide and haunted. Eliza, in turn, was a bastion of calm, a quiet, protective presence, her mind racing with the dangerous knowledge she now possessed. Don Marco Moretti returned from his business trip just before lunch. He walked into his magnificent home and sensed the change in the atmosphere immediately. The new easy peace of the house had been replaced by a tense, somber quiet. He saw the way his son was attached to Eliza, looking at her with a new, desperate dependence. Marco's old familiar paranoia flared. What had happened while he was gone? What secrets was this woman now sharing with his son? He found Eliza alone in the library a little while later. "What happened last night?" he demanded, his voice a low, controlled growl. "Matteo, he is different. He seems frightened." Eliza met his suspicious gaze, her own expression calm and steady. She would not, could not, betray Matteo's trust. "He had a bad dream, Don Marco," she said, her voice even, "a very bad one. It upset him." Her careful, partial truth only fueled his suspicion. "My son's well-being is my business," he said, his voice cold. "I will not have secrets in my own home. I want to know what you are talking to him about." He was a man who did not like to be kept in the dark. If she would not tell him, he would find out for himself. Later that afternoon, Eliza knew she needed to help Matteo process the terrible memory that his nightmare had unearthed. She led him to their sanctuary, the sun-dappled gazebo at the edge of the garden. It was a place of trust, a place where he could speak without fear. She did not know that deep in the heart of the mansion, in the cold, dark security room, Don Marco was watching. Determined to uncover the conspiracy he was sure was unfolding, he had activated a small, hidden microphone that his men had installed near the gazebo years ago. He was expecting to hear whispers of betrayal. He was about to hear the sound of his own heart breaking. He watched on the monitor as Eliza gently prompted Matteo. "Tell me again," she signed. "You are safe. Tell me what you saw." And Marco watched as his son, his small face a mask of sorrow, began to tell the story. The story of the accident. This time the signs were not frantic, but slow, deliberate, and full of a child's terrible, clear-eyed memory. Marco watched as Matteo's hands described the car. Driving fast. He saw the sign for a loud noise, and then for Mommy, screaming. He watched, his own blood running cold, as his son's hands described the world turning upside down, the terrible, sharp explosion of broken glass. And then, the final horrific image, his 10-year-old son signing the word red, and then slowly, with a trembling finger, tracing a line down his own cheek. The silent, signed memory of his mother's blood. The official story, the one Marco had told the world and himself for 5 years, was that his wife had died instantly in a fiery crash. He had spared himself the details, hiding behind the clinical, redacted police reports. He had never known that his 5-year-old son had been awake, had been watching, had seen it all. In the dark security room, the cold, powerful, and untouchable Don Marco Moretti finally shattered. A great, silent, and agonizing sob tore through him, a sound of pure, undiluted grief and a guilt so profound it was a physical weight. He collapsed forward, his head in his hands, weeping for the little boy who had carried this impossible burden alone, in complete and utter silence, for 5 long years. On the screen, he saw Eliza pull his son into a gentle, comforting hug. She was the one holding his child, providing the comfort that he, the father, should have been providing all along. His last shred of suspicion, his last vestige of paranoia, was burned away in the fire of his own tears. It was replaced by a wave of eternal, boundless, and humbling gratitude for the quiet, gentle woman who had bravely walked into the darkness of his son's mind and had, with a grace he could not comprehend, shown him the way out. She had not just taught his son a language, she had just unlocked his soul. The days that followed Marco's emotional breakthrough were like the first days of a new world. The heavy, oppressive grief that had suffocated the glass castle for 5 years had finally been released. In its place, a new, lighter, and more hopeful atmosphere settled. Marco was a changed man. The cold, distant Don was gone, replaced by a father who was present, who was learning, and who was for the first time truly healing alongside his son. He would spend hours each day with Eliza and Matteo, his large, powerful hands moving with a clumsy but determined effort as he learned the beautiful, silent language that had saved them all. He was no longer just watching his son's life from a distance. He was an active, joyful participant in it. This was the scene that Rico, his second-in-command, walked in on the following week. He had arrived for a business meeting and found them on the veranda, the 3 of them, heads bent together over a sign-language picture book, a soft, easy laughter passing between them. Rico watched from the doorway, and a cold, venomous jealousy coiled in his gut. He did not see a healing family. He saw a dangerous weakness. He saw the Don, his powerful, ruthless boss, going soft, being tamed by a housekeeper and a broken boy. He saw a woman who had, in a matter of weeks, gained more influence over Marco than he had managed in 15 years of loyal, bloody service. He saw his own future, his own ambition to one day lead the Moretti Empire, dissolving in this new, soft, domestic world. He decided in that moment, for the good of the family, and for the good of his own future, that the woman had to go. His plan was a masterpiece of cold, calculated treachery. He knew he could no longer use Marco's own paranoia against Eliza. Marco's trust in her was now absolute. So he would have to provide proof of a betrayal so undeniable that even a man in love could not ignore it. His first step was to acquire an untraceable burner phone. His second was to use a trusted, anonymous cutout to send a single, cryptic text message to a number he knew belonged to a lieutenant in the rival Falcone family. The message was simple. "I have information on Moretti's new port shipping routes. Await instructions." The third and most difficult step was to plant the phone on Eliza. He needed the perfect opportunity. It came 2 days later. He knew Eliza did the household's fresh market shopping in Cabo Frio every Friday morning. He also knew she was a creature of habit. He arranged for one of his most skilled and invisible pickpockets to be at the market. Rico orchestrated a chance encounter in the bustling, colorful market. As Eliza was choosing vegetables, he appeared, all smiles and polite surprise. "Eliza, what a coincidence to see you here." While he distracted her for no more than 10 seconds with pleasant, meaningless chatter, his man slipped silently through the crowd, and the small burner phone was deposited, like a poisonous egg, into the bottom of her large wicker market bag. The trap was set. Now all he had to do was spring it. He waited one more day, allowing the betrayal to take root. Then he requested an urgent private meeting with Marco at the villa. He entered the study, his face a perfect mask of grave, reluctant concern. "Don Marco," he began, his voice low and serious. "We have a problem, a serious one. My surveillance on the Falcones, it picked up a communication yesterday. They have a new source, an informant." Marco immediately tensed. "Inside my organization?" "Worse," Rico said, his voice full of feigned regret. "Inside your house." He showed Marco a printout of the intercepted text message. "I have information on Moretti's new port shipping routes." "After we saw this," Rico continued, his lies smooth and practiced, "we did a discreet electronic sweep for any unauthorized communication devices on the property. We found a burner phone." He paused, letting the weight of his next words land with the force of a physical blow. "I am so sorry, Don Marco," he said, his eyes full of a perfect false sympathy. "We found it in Eliza May's market bag." The words hit the air with a dead, final thud. Marco stared at him, his face draining of all color. He had just found his son. He had just found his heart. He had just found a woman he was beginning to believe he could build a new life with. And now he was being presented with what appeared to be irrefutable, undeniable, and soul-shattering proof that the woman who had performed a miracle in his home was, in fact, a traitor, a spy, who was about to endanger his entire family. The beautiful, sunlit peak of his new happiness had just crumbled, plunging him into a dark, cold, and impossible abyss. The words and the small, damning burner phone that Rico placed on the polished desk landed in the silent study with the force of a bomb. Marco stared at the evidence, a cold, familiar numbness spreading through his chest. It was the feeling he knew best, the icy certainty of betrayal. Rico stood before him, a grim, loyal soldier delivering the terrible news, waiting for the inevitable command. The world Marco lived in had simple, brutal rules for traitors. The evidence was clear, the conclusion was foregone. His face hardened into the cold, impenetrable mask of the Don. He should, by every law he had ever lived by, give the order to have her removed, permanently. But as he opened his mouth to speak, a series of images, vivid and unbidden, flashed through his mind. Eliza in the garden, her hand patiently forming the sign for friend. Eliza, her face full of a quiet, remembered pain as she signed the story of her deaf brother. Eliza, her head thrown back in a silent, joyful laugh as she watched his son. He looked down at the evidence again. The cryptic text. The burner phone. It was all too perfect, too neat. A story so perfectly constructed it felt staged. And then he remembered another image. His son's small, frantic hands, signing a warning he had dismissed. Snake. The father, the man who had just begun to hope, was now at war with the Don, and for the first time in his life the Don was beginning to doubt. He looked up at Rico, his expression now unreadable, his eyes as cold and as hard as obsidian. "Leave it with me, Rico," he said, his voice a dangerously quiet command. "I will handle this matter myself in my own way." Rico's face flickered with a momentary, almost imperceptible flash of surprise and disappointment. He had expected an immediate, violent resolution. "But Don Marco, the threat—" "You are not to go near her," Marco cut him off, his voice like ice. "You are not to speak of this to anyone. You will consider the matter closed and in my hands. Is that understood?" "Yes, Don Marco," Rico said, bowing his head in a mask of perfect, loyal obedience. After Rico was gone, Marco knew he had to act. He could not ignore the evidence, but he could no longer blindly trust it either. He was walking a tightrope between his heart and his head, and one wrong step could be fatal for Eliza and for his own soul. He had to protect his organization if she was a spy, and he had to protect her from Rico if she was being framed. He found her where she always was, in the garden with Matteo. The sight of their easy, trusting affection was a fresh stab of pain in his heart. He hardened himself. This was not the father acting now. This was the Don. "Matteo," he called, his voice a harsh command. "Go inside with Antonio." A guard, who had been standing at a discreet distance, stepped forward. Matteo looked from his father's hard face to Eliza's confused one, a look of fear dawning in his eyes, but he obeyed. Once they were alone, Marco turned to Eliza. His face was a cold, emotionless mask, the man she was beginning to love completely gone. "Eliza," he said, his voice formal and devoid of any warmth, "there has been a serious security breach within this household. Until I can get to the bottom of it, for your own protection you are to be confined to your suite of rooms. You will not have contact with anyone. A guard will be posted at your door." She stared at him, her face a picture of pure, baffled terror. "What? Marco, what are you talking about? What have I done?" "This is not a discussion," he said, his voice brutal, because it was the only way he could get through this without breaking. "It is an order." The chapter ended in a haze of fear and confusion. Eliza was escorted to her room, a terrified prisoner in the glass castle she had thought was a sanctuary. Matteo watched from his bedroom window, his heart breaking, seeing the woman he trusted being taken away by his father's men. And Marco was left standing alone in his magnificent, sunlit garden. He had just imprisoned the woman he was falling in love with. He had just terrified his own son. He felt like a monster, but the Don within him knew this was the only way. He had to control the board to find the real traitor. He was now in a desperate, lonely race against time to solve the mystery, before the choice he had just made destroyed them all. The Moretti villa for 2 days was a prison of silent, shared misery. Eliza was confined to her beautiful suite, a prisoner in a gilded cage, her heart a confusing mix of terror and a deep aching disappointment in the man she had just begun to trust. Marco was a ghost in his own study, poring over Rico's perfectly constructed evidence, his mind at war with a heart that screamed, this was all a lie. And Matteo, in his own room, was not silent and withdrawn. He was filled with a cold, focused and burning anger. He knew with the absolute, unwavering certainty of a child's pure instinct that Rico was the snake. He knew his father had made a terrible, foolish mistake. And he knew with a dawning and heavy sense of responsibility that he was the only person who could possibly fix it. He could not just accuse Rico. He had seen the way his father's world worked. He needed proof. He closed his eyes and thought back, his mind, a tool honed by years of silent observation, replaying the events of the day the burner phone was found. It was Friday, the day Eliza went to the market. He replayed the morning in his head. He remembered Eliza in the kitchen, getting her wicker market bag ready. He remembered her leaving it on the counter for a few minutes while the two of them went out onto the veranda to check on a hummingbird feeder. And then he remembered something else. He remembered Rico walking through the kitchen during that exact time. He was on his way to his father's study. He had paused, looked around, given Matteo a curt, dismissive nod, and then continued on his way. At the time, The moment had been completely insignificant. Now it was everything. Rico had said the informant was found while Eliza was at the market, but he had been in the kitchen alone with her bag before she ever left the house. He had the opportunity. Rico hadn't found the phone, he had planted it. Armed with this crucial, timeline-shattering piece of the puzzle, Matteo went to his father. He found Marco in his study, looking pale and exhausted, staring at the burner phone which still sat on his desk like a coiled serpent. Matteo did not hesitate. He walked to the large whiteboard that was normally used for his father's business strategies. He picked up a black marker. This was his testimony. With a frantic, focused energy, he began to draw. He drew a simple timeline of Friday morning. At the beginning of the line, he drew a picture of the sun rising. Then he drew a stick figure of Eliza and himself in the garden. He drew her market bag alone on the kitchen counter. Then, with a furious, dark stroke, he drew a snake with Rico's cold eyes walking through the kitchen. Next, he drew Eliza leaving the house. Finally, he wrote the time that Rico had claimed the message was intercepted. He drew a big, angry X through it. He turned to his father, his hands now speaking the language Eliza had given him. "Wrong," he signed, his movements sharp and absolute. "Wrong, wrong, wrong." He then pointed to the snake on the board and made the sign for liar. Marco watched, completely transfixed, as his son laid out the entire conspiracy with a brilliant, undeniable clarity. The irrefutable evidence was not the phone. It was his son's eyewitness account. It was the detail that the traitor, in his arrogance, had overlooked. Rico's perfectly constructed story had just been completely and utterly demolished by a 10-year-old boy. The last of the Don's doubt, the last vestige of his cold, professional paranoia, was burned away in a sudden, brilliant flash of truth. He looked at his son. This was not a broken, silent child. This was a brilliant, brave, and fiercely loyal young man who had just used the very secret language Marco had feared to save the woman they both loved. A wave of pride and love so powerful it almost brought him to his knees, washed over him. He strode across the room and pulled his son into a fierce, tight hug. "Thank you, Matteo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." He now knew who the real traitor in his house was, and he knew with a cold absolute certainty what he had to do. He released his son, his face now a mask of calm, lethal resolve. He walked to his desk and picked up the phone. "Get me Rico," he commanded. "Tell him I need to see him immediately." After sending Matteo back to his room with a trusted guard and a quiet, reassuring look, Marco sat alone in his study and waited. The quiet, conflicted father was gone. In his place was Don Marco Moretti, a man whose entire world was built on a single unbreakable principle: loyalty. And he was about to sit face to face with a man who had committed the ultimate sin. Rico entered the study a few minutes later, his face a perfect, confident mask of loyal concern. He saw the cold, hard expression on his boss's face and assumed a decision had been made about the woman. He believed he was here to receive his orders for her removal. He believed he had won. "Close the door, Rico," Marco said, his voice a low, quiet rumble. Rico did as he was told. He stood before the large glass desk, ready. Marco poured 2 glasses of scotch from the crystal decanter on his desk. He pushed one across the polished surface toward his second-in-command. "You were right to be suspicious, Rico," Marco began, his voice deceptively calm. "There was a traitor in this house. The evidence you brought me was very compelling." A small, triumphant smile touched Rico's lips. "I only serve to protect the family, Don Marco." "Of course," Marco said, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "The timing, however, was the most interesting part of the puzzle. You said the Falcone's message was intercepted and the phone was discovered, while Eliza was at the market. A very specific timeline." "Yes, Don Marco," Rico said, his confidence unwavering. "My operative was very precise." "He must have been," Marco said, his voice dropping a little lower, a little colder, "because I now have a witness. A witness who places you in my kitchen, standing right next to Eliza's unattended market bag, a full 10 minutes before she ever left the house." The color drained from Rico's face. His confident smirk vanished. "Who?" he stammered, his mind racing. "A cook? A servant. They are mistaken. Marco leaned forward, his eyes as cold and as hard as polished stone. My son, he said, the two words landing like hammer blows. It seems Matteo sees a great deal more than people give him credit for. He drew me a picture of it, a very detailed picture. It was over. Rico was trapped, his perfect, intricate lie completely and utterly demolished by the silent, watchful eyes of a 10-year-old boy. The mask of loyalty shattered, revealing the raw, ugly face of his ambition and his contempt. That boy, he spat, his voice a venomous hiss. He should have been a ghost. You, with your grief, you were becoming weak, Marco, soft, and that woman. She was making it worse. I did what I did for the good of this family, to protect it from your sentimentality. Marco listened to the treacherous, self-serving confession without a single flicker of emotion on his face. When Rico was finished, Marco's judgment was swift, cold, and absolute. You are a snake, Rico, he said, his voice a deadly whisper. And I have no room for snakes in my garden. He pressed a small, discreet button under his desk. You will leave this house, you will leave this city, you will leave this country. You will take nothing with you. Your name from this moment on is a whisper of the past. If I ever see your face or hear your name in my territory again, I will not be so merciful. The study doors opened, and two of Marco's most loyal and most imposing guards stepped inside. They flanked a pale, trembling, and utterly defeated Rico. Get him out of my sight, Marco commanded. They escorted Rico from the room and from the Moretti Empire, forever. The serpent had been removed. Marco was left alone in the silent study. He felt no triumph, only the grim, cold satisfaction of a necessary execution. He looked over at the whiteboard, at his son's messy, brilliant, and brave drawings that had exposed the truth. He understood the profound irony. His empire, built on a brutal code of power and fear, had been saved by the simple, honest love of a silent boy and the quiet, unassuming woman who had given him back his voice. He had dealt with the traitor. Now, his final and most important task remained. He had to go to Eliza and set her free. After Rico had been escorted from the property, a grim footnote in the Moretti family history, a profound quiet settled over Marco's study. The immediate threat was gone, the traitor vanquished. But the victory felt hollow, incomplete. He had purged the poison from his organization, but the antidote for the poison he had inflicted upon his own home, upon Eliza, was yet to be administered. He felt a deep and profound shame. He, the great Don Marco Moretti, a man whose judgment was law, had been so easily manipulated, so willingly blind, and he had made an innocent woman a prisoner in his home. His walk from the study to her suite in the guest wing was the longest walk of his life. The staff he passed in the hallways averted their eyes, sensing the seismic shift that had occurred. He arrived at her door to find one of his guards standing there, a stoic, silent sentinel. The sight of the guard, a symbol of his own terrible, paranoid mistake, sent a fresh wave of self-loathing through him. "You're dismissed," he said to the guard, his voice a low growl. "Go." He stood alone before her door for a long moment, his heart pounding. This was a confrontation more terrifying than any he had ever faced in his dangerous life. He knocked softly. The door opened. Eliza stood there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes full of a guarded, fearful questioning. The sight of her, so full of a grace she couldn't hide even in her fear, broke his heart. "Eliza," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to conceal. "I am so sorry." She just looked at him, waiting. "May I come in?" he asked, a supplicant at her door. She stepped back, allowing him to enter. He did not take the seat of power in the plush armchair. He sat on the small, simple ottoman, deliberately making himself smaller, her equal. And then he told her everything. He told her about Rico's initial poisonous whispers. He told her about the burner phone, the intercepted text, the seemingly irrefutable evidence. He explained the brutal, unforgiving rules of his world and the terrible, impossible choice he had been faced with. And then, his voice softening with a father's infinite pride, he told her how Matteo had saved them all. He described the timeline on the whiteboard, the drawing of the snake, the fierce, brave, and brilliant defense her student had mounted on her behalf. As she listened, the fear and confusion in her eyes melted away, replaced by a wave of pure, overwhelming relief, and then by tears, not for her own ordeal, but for the brave little boy who had stood up for her. "When I confined you to this room," Marco said, his voice now a low, pained confession as he stood and walked to the window, "I told myself it was for your protection. That was a lie. It was to protect myself, to protect my world from a truth I was afraid to face." He turned to her, his heart in his eyes. "The truth, Eliza, is that this house is not a home without you. My son is not whole without you. And I am not whole without you." He took a step toward her. "I am not offering you your job back," he said. "I am asking you to share my life, to be a permanent, cherished, and essential part of this family, to be my partner in everything." The offer, so much bigger and more profound than a simple apology, hung in the sunlit air between them. The prison had become a sanctuary again, and now it was being offered as a home. "And Matteo," she whispered, her own voice trembling. A real, true, and unburdened smile finally broke through Marco's grim expression. "Matteo is downstairs," he said. "He is waiting for his friend, and his father is waiting for his partner." The last wall between them, the last vestige of secrets and suspicion, had finally completely crumbled. The truth had set them both free. And in the quiet, sun-drenched room, a new, beautiful, and deeply hopeful future was just beginning. Eliza and Marco walked out of the guest suite together, hand in hand, and stepped back into the life of the house. The guard who had been posted at her door was gone. The few staff members who saw them pass in the long, sunlit hallway immediately understood. Their heads bowed in a new kind of respect. The quiet housekeeper was no longer just an employee. She was the heart of the home, and she was to be honored as such. They descended the grand, floating staircase into the main living area. Matteo was waiting for them at the bottom. He had clearly been watching, his small body a coiled spring of anxiety and desperate hope. The moment he saw them, together, their hands intertwined, his entire body sagged with a wave of pure, unadulterated relief. He ran to them, not a full child's run, but a quick, urgent shuffle. He didn't go to his father. He went straight to Eliza, throwing his arms around her waist and burying his face in her side, his small hands clutching her dress as if he were afraid she might otherwise disappear. Marco knelt down, bringing himself to their level, his own heart aching with a love so powerful it felt like it might break him. The three of them were a small, tight circle of reunion. Matteo looked up at his father, his dark, intense eyes full of 100 silent questions. "Is it over? Is she staying? Are we safe now?" Marco, his own hands now fluent in the language of his son's heart, signed the answer, his movements clear, strong, and absolute. Yes, always, family. The confirmation, the final, absolute vanquishing of every fear that had haunted his young life, the loss of his mother, the loneliness of his silence, the terror of losing Eliza, was too much for his silent world to contain. He was overwhelmed with a feeling so powerful, so immense, that his hands were no longer enough to express it. He looked at his father, his hero, the man who had faced down the snake in their garden and won. He looked at the strong, loving face of the man who had just saved them all. His small face crumpled, tears of pure, unrestrained joy streaming down his cheeks. His mouth opened. A small, rusty and unused sound escaped his throat, a sound of pure, vocalized emotion. He struggled with it for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. And then the first real word he had spoken since the day his mother had died 5 years ago, broke free in a clear, strong, and breathtakingly beautiful whisper. "Papa." The single word struck Marco with the force of a physical blow. His entire world, which had been slowly, carefully pieced back together over the past few weeks, suddenly and finally clicked into a state of perfect, brilliant, and unbreakable wholeness. He stared at his son, the sound of his own name, a name he had not heard from his child's lips in an eternity, echoing in his soul. A great, shuddering sob of pure, cathartic joy tore from his chest. He reached out, pulling both Matteo and Eliza into a fierce, tight, and weeping embrace. For a long, beautiful moment, the only sound in the vast, silent mansion was the sound of a father crying with a happiness so profound, so complete and so hard-won, it was almost painful. Later, the three of them sat together on the veranda, the warm, bright spring sun on their faces. The storm was over. The healing, for the most part, was done. Matteo was quiet, as was his nature. But his silence was different now. It was no longer a locked room. It was a peaceful garden. It was a choice. Marco looked at his son, and then at the incredible woman who was now his partner. He realized that the investigation, the confrontation with Rico, the reclaiming of his own home, that had all been about cleaning up the wreckage of the past. This moment, this was the true beginning of their future. He had thought Eliza's greatest gift to his family was the beautiful silent language of the hands. He understood now that her true gift had been infinitely greater. She had given his son back his voice, and in doing so she had given him back his entire world. The morning after Matteo had spoken, the Moretti villa was filled with a giddy, fragile, and disbelieving joy. Marco and Eliza watched the boy with a tender, anxious hope, hanging on his every silence, waiting for another word. But Matteo remained quiet. He still communicated primarily with his hands, the silent language his only comfortable home. The single beautiful word he had spoken seemed to have been an emotional lightning strike, a miraculous and unrepeatable event. They realized then that the first word was not a final destination. It was the opening of a door onto a new, long, and challenging path. Marco, now a man who fully embraced a blended approach to healing, got to work. He did not dismiss the doctors. He found the right one. After a week of careful research, they welcomed Dr. Alana Rice, the most respected and compassionate pediatric speech therapist in Rio de Janeiro, into their home. Dr. Rice was a warm, kind woman who, upon seeing Matteo and Eliza converse fluently in sign language, did not see a crutch. She saw a bridge. "This is a gift," she told a relieved Marco and Eliza after her first session with the boy. "He has a fully formed, complex language center in his brain. The connection to his vocal cords is just asleep. Our job is not to replace this beautiful language," she said, nodding toward his hands, "but to use it as a guide to help him find a new one." And so began the hard, patient, and often frustrating work of waking up a voice. The months that followed were a testament to the family's shared, unwavering resolve. The therapy sessions with Dr. Rice were a slow, careful process of making sounds, of feeling the vibration of his own vocal cords, of moving from a simple ah to a ma, and then finally to a whispered mama for his mother in heaven. Their family dinners became a gentle, encouraging classroom. Marco and Eliza would both speak and sign a word, and Matteo would try to repeat it, his voice often a soft, hesitant rasp. There were stumbles and mispronunciations, but there was never any pressure, only an endless supply of patience and a great deal of gentle, loving laughter. And every night Eliza would read to him, and then he, in turn, would try to read a single, simple sentence back to her. His voice was quiet, the words slow and deliberate, but it was there. It was his. There were moments of deep frustration, days when the words wouldn't come, when his old familiar silence felt safer, and he would revert to signing in a rush of angry, frustrated gestures. But on those days, Marco would sit with him, his own hands now steady and sure. "It's okay," he would sign. "Take your time. I am listening." The true breakthrough, the moment the hard work blossomed into effortless joy, came on a beautiful sunny afternoon 3 months later. The three of them were in the garden when a tiny iridescent hummingbird appeared, hovering for a moment over a brilliant red hibiscus flower. Matteo was so filled with a sudden, pure and unthinking delight that he forgot to think about forming words. He forgot to sign. He simply turned to his father and his new mother, his face alight with a joy that was too big to be contained in silence, and a full, clear, and perfectly formed sentence came tumbling out. "Look," he cried, his voice ringing with a beautiful new music. "The flying jewel is back." Marco and Eliza froze, stunned into a breathless, joyous silence. It was his first, spontaneous, complex, and utterly perfect sentence. It was the culmination of months of tireless work, of 1,000 small hard-won victories. It was the sound of their hope, made real. Tears of pure, overwhelming happiness streamed down their faces. Later, as the sun began to set, the three of them sat together on the veranda. And Matteo talked, he chatted. He told them, in his still quiet but now confident voice, all about the hummingbird, about the colors of the sunset, about a funny dream he'd had the night before. Marco listened, his heart so full he felt it might burst. The first word, Papa, had been a gift for him, a moment of profound personal healing. But this was different. This was the sound of his son's own joy. The sound of a boy free from his silent prison, finally able to describe the beauty of the world around him. The healing was no longer just about reclaiming the past. It was now, finally, about embracing the beautiful, noisy, and wonderful future. The day after Matteo's first clear and spontaneous sentence was one of quiet, disbelieving joy. The word had been a miracle, a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 5 long years. But as the days turned into a week, it became clear that the door, while unlocked, was not yet wide open. Matteo's voice, when he used it, was hesitant and quiet. The muscles were weak, the habit of silence deeply ingrained. He would often get frustrated when trying to form a complex thought, his hands automatically jumping up to sign with a speed and fluency his tongue could not yet match. A new, subtle barrier had appeared. The staff, eager to hear him speak, would watch him with an expectant pressure that often made him retreat back into his comfortable silence. Marco, now a man who saw the world through the lens of a deeply attentive father, noticed this immediately. He saw the staff's well-intentioned but clumsy attempts to engage, their lack of understanding of the signing that was still Matteo's native tongue. He knew he had to do something. The following Monday morning, he called a formal meeting of the entire household staff. This was a rare and intimidating event, and the staff gathered in the grand living room, their expressions a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. Marco stood before them, not as the intimidating Don, but simply as a father. Eliza and Matteo stood at his side. "As you all know," he began, his voice calm and serious, "my son Matteo is beginning a new journey. He is finding his voice again." "But he already has a voice," he said, gesturing to Matteo's hands. "A beautiful, intelligent, and expressive language that has been his only friend for a very long time. This language is not a crutch, it is a part of who he is, and in this house we will honor it." He looked at each member of his staff, his command absolute. "From this day forward, American Sign Language will be an official language of the Moretti household. I have hired a professional instructor. Weekly classes will be held here for every single one of you. Your attendance is mandatory, and your time will be compensated. You will all learn." A wave of stunned silence, followed by a murmur of surprised approval, went through the room. The first lesson was held that Friday. The vast formal dining room was transformed into a classroom. The formidable head chef sat next to a young gardener, the stoic security guards next to the quiet housekeepers. They sat together, their large, clumsy hands awkwardly trying to form the letters of the alphabet, their expressions a mixture of intense concentration and shared, humorous frustration. At the front of the room, helping the instructor, were Eliza and Matteo. Matteo, who had for so long been the silent, invisible boy, was now a teacher, his own small hands moving with a new, confident grace as he patiently corrected a guard's clumsy attempt at the letter B. Later that afternoon, a young housekeeper, seeing Matteo in the hallway, paused. She hesitated, then slowly, carefully raised her hands and signed, "Good afternoon, Matteo." The boy's face broke into a brilliant, beautiful smile, and he enthusiastically signed back. From his study doorway, Marco witnessed the small, profound exchange. He realized that his decree had done more than just ease his son's frustration. It had transformed the very culture of his home, from one built on a hierarchy of fear and silent service, to one built on a foundation of communication, of mutual respect, and of a shared, collective effort to understand. With the whole house now joyfully engaged in learning their new language, the last, deepest shadow in the family's heart remained to be addressed. The anniversary of his wife's death was approaching. In years past, It had been a day of grim, solitary grief for Marco. A day he would lock himself in his study with a bottle of whiskey, leaving Matteo to navigate the heavy, unspoken sadness of the house alone. This year had to be different. He sat with Eliza and Matteo on the veranda, the place where so many of their new beginnings had taken root. "Next week," he began, his voice quiet, "is the anniversary of the day we lost your mother." Matteo grew very still. "I don't want it to be a sad day anymore," Marco continued, his voice full of a new, hard-won wisdom. "I want it to be a day where we remember her, with love." He looked at his son. "What do you think we should do?" Matteo was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant blue horizon. Then his hands and his new, quiet voice worked together. "Can we visit her?" he asked. He had never been to her grave. The visit took place on a beautiful, clear spring morning. The cemetery was a peaceful green space on a hill overlooking the endless expanse of the ocean. The three of them walked hand in hand to the simple, elegant marble headstone that read, "Isabella Moretti, beloved wife and mother." They brought a bouquet of her favorite flowers, white lilies. Marco stood before the grave, a silent, grieving husband, lost in his own memories. It was Eliza who provided the strength, her hand a warm, steady presence in his, her other arm wrapped securely around Matteo's shoulders. After a long, quiet moment, Matteo stepped forward. He stood before his mother's grave, a small, brave soldier, and for the first time he told her his story. "Mommy," he began, his voice a little shaky but clear, his hands moving in concert with his words, a beautiful, dual-language eulogy. "I miss you." He told her about the long years of silence. And then he turned and gestured to Eliza. "I want you to meet someone. This is Eliza. She's my best friend. She taught my hands how to talk again, and my mouth too. She's going to be our family now." He looked back at the cold stone, his voice full of a simple, profound and healing conviction. I think you would have loved her." The act of introduction, of formally and lovingly bridging his cherished past with his hopeful future, was the final, most important step in his own healing. Marco, listening to his son's incredible, mature grace, finally let go of the last of the guilt he had carried for 5 long years, a quiet, cleansing wave of tears rolling down his face. Matteo then took a single, perfect white lily from the bouquet and placed it at the base of the headstone. They stood there for a moment longer, not as a broken man and his new, fragile family, but as a single, whole, and unbreakable unit. Marco looked at his son, who had just honored his mother with more wisdom and love than he himself had ever been able to muster. He looked at Eliza, the incredible woman who had made it all possible, who had not just healed his son, but had healed him too. He finally understood that honoring his late wife's memory was not about preserving the past in a silent, grieving shrine. It was about building a future that was worthy of her love. And as he stood there, his hand in Eliza's, his other arm around his son, he knew with a certainty that filled his entire being that they were finally doing just that. The visit to his wife's grave marked a final, quiet turning point for Marco. The ghosts of his past had been faced, honored, and lovingly integrated into the fabric of his new life. With the internal battles finally won, he turned his attention to the external world, to the empire he commanded, and he saw it for the first time through Eliza's eyes. He saw the shadows, the fear and the violence upon which his fortune was built, and he felt a deep, profound sense of shame. The test of his transformation came a few weeks later. A rival family had made a move on one of his most profitable shipping routes, a blatant act of aggression. His lieutenants gathered in his study, the air thick with tension, their proposed solutions brutal, efficient and bloody. It was the language of his old world. Marco listened, his face an unreadable mask. He looked at the hard, violent faces of the men he had surrounded himself with for decades. Then his gaze fell upon a small, colorful drawing taped to the corner of his desk, a picture of a sailboat that Matteo had given him. He made a decision. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, silencing the entire room. "There will be no bloodshed." He stood and walked to the large glass window overlooking the peaceful, sunlit ocean. The old ways are over. The Moretti family is no longer in the business of breaking things. From now on, we build. He shocked them all by outlining a different kind of solution, a brilliant, strategic and entirely legitimate business maneuver to acquire the rival's shipping company, absorbing their power instead of destroying it. It was the move of a CEO, not a Don. Later that day, he told Eliza what he had done. "I want to build a future that my son can be proud to inherit," he said, his voice full of a new, quiet purpose. A future free from these shadows. His first major act as this new man was not a business acquisition. He came to Eliza with the research she had done months ago on the community school her deaf brother Daniel had attended, a place that was now struggling with funding. "I want to build something real," he said, his voice full of a passion she had never heard from him before. "A place of hope. I want to build a new center, in your brother's name, a state-of-the-art facility for children with communication disabilities. And I want you to design it, to lead it. Let's use our power for this." And so began their new project, their first true partnership. He handled the finances and construction, his power now a force for unambiguous good, and she designed the heart of it, a place of compassion and understanding. The chapter ended with them standing in Marco's study, but it was no longer a war room. It was an architect's office. Spread across his desk were the blueprints for the future Daniel May Center for Communication. He had spent his entire life building an empire based on fear. Now, for the first time, he was building something based purely on love. He looked at Eliza, his partner in this new, better world, and he realized with a profound clarity that this was a different and far, far greater kind of power. With the plans for the new community center underway, and their family life settled into a rhythm of deep, quiet joy, there was only one foundation left for Marco to build. He chose an evening a few weeks later. It was a quiet Tuesday, a night of no particular significance, which was exactly why it was perfect. Their love was not about grand occasions. It was about the beautiful, profound peace of their ordinary life. His first and most important act was to bring his co-conspirator on board. He found Matteo in his room reading. He sat on the edge of his son's bed and, using a mixture of his now confident sign language and a quiet voice, he told his son that he wanted to ask Eliza to marry him. Matteo's face broke into a smile so brilliant it lit up the entire room. He was not just a supporter, he was an enthusiastic partner in the plan. He helped his father choose the ring, a simple, elegant sapphire the color of the Cabo Frio Sea. And he helped him plan the perfect, simple setting. That night, Marco and Matteo together invited Eliza for a surprise in the garden. She followed them, a curious, loving smile on her face. They led her to their sanctuary, the small gazebo, which the two Moretti men had secretly decorated with dozens of strands of twinkling fairy lights, transforming it into a magical, glowing wonderland. Marco's heart was pounding. He, a man who had faced down rival bosses and threats of violence without flinching, was terrified. He took Eliza's hand. Matteo stood proudly at his father's side. "Eliza," he began, his voice rough with an emotion that was as powerful as it was new to him. "Before you came here, this was just a house. I was just a Don, and my heart was a locked, empty room. You and your incredible, brave heart, you gave me back my son, and in doing so, you gave me back myself. You taught me how to speak the language of love." He then got down on one knee, a gesture of surrender and devotion. Matteo, with great ceremony, handed him the small velvet box. "I know I don't deserve the lifetime of goodness you represent," he said, his eyes shining as he looked up at her. "But I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to. Eliza May, will you marry me and officially make us a family?" He opened the box. The beautiful sapphire glittered in the magical twinkling light. Eliza, her face wet with happy, silent tears, could only nod at first. Then she found her voice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. 1,000 times. Yes." As he slid the ring onto her finger, Matteo let out a triumphant cheer and launched himself at them, his arms wrapping around them both in a fierce, joyful hug. The three of them stood there for a long time, a perfect, unbreakable circle of love in the glowing gazebo, their new official family finally, and completely formed. The great oppressive silence of the Moretti mansion had been filled, once and for all, not just with words, but with the beautiful, powerful, and everlasting promise of a lifetime of love and laughter. The day after Matteo's first clear and spontaneous sentence was one of quiet, disbelieving joy. The word had been a miracle, a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 5 long years. But as the days turned into a week, it became clear that the door, while unlocked, was not yet wide open. Matteo's voice, when he used it, was hesitant and quiet. The muscles were weak, the habit of silence deeply ingrained. He would often get frustrated when trying to form a complex thought, his hands automatically jumping up to sign with a speed and fluency his tongue could not yet match. A new subtle barrier had appeared. The staff, eager to hear him speak, would watch him with an expectant pressure that often made him retreat back into his comfortable silence. Marco, now a man who saw the world through the lens of a deeply attentive father, noticed this immediately. He saw the staff's well-intentioned but clumsy attempts to engage, their lack of understanding of the signing that was still Matteo's native tongue. He knew he had to do something. The following Monday morning, he called a formal meeting of the entire household staff. This was a rare and intimidating event, and the staff gathered in the grand living room, their expressions a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. Marco stood before them, not as the intimidating Don, but simply as a father. Eliza and Matteo stood at his side. "As you all know," he began, his voice calm and serious, "my son Matteo is beginning a new journey. He is finding his voice again." "But he already has a voice," he said, gesturing to Matteo's hands. "A beautiful, intelligent, and expressive language that has been his only friend for a very long time. This language is not a crutch, it is a part of who he is, and in this house we will honor it." He looked at each member of his staff, his command absolute. "From this day forward, American Sign Language will be an official language of the Moretti household. I have hired a professional instructor. Weekly classes will be held here for every single one of you. Your attendance is mandatory, and your time will be compensated. You will all learn." A wave of stunned silence, followed by a murmur of surprised approval, went through the room. The first lesson was held that Friday. The vast formal dining room was transformed into a classroom. The formidable head chef sat next to a young gardener, the stoic security guards next to the quiet housekeepers. They sat together, their large, clumsy hands awkwardly trying to form the letters of the alphabet, their expressions a mixture of intense concentration and shared, humorous frustration. At the front of the room, helping the instructor, were Eliza and Matteo. Matteo, who had for so long been the silent, invisible boy, was now a teacher, his own small hands moving with a new, confident grace as he patiently corrected a guard's clumsy attempt at the letter B. Later that afternoon, a young housekeeper, seeing Matteo in the hallway, paused. She hesitated, then slowly, carefully raised her hands and signed, "Good afternoon, Matteo." The boy's face broke into a brilliant, beautiful smile, and he enthusiastically signed back. From his study doorway, Marco witnessed the small, profound exchange. He realized that his decree had done more than just ease his son's frustration. It had transformed the very culture of his home, from one built on a hierarchy of fear and silent service, to one based on a foundation of communication, of mutual respect, and of a shared, collective effort to understand. With the whole house now joyfully engaged in learning their new language, the last, deepest shadow in the family's heart remained to be addressed. The anniversary of his wife's death was approaching. In years past, it had been a day of grim, solitary grief for Marco, a day he would lock himself in his study with a bottle of whiskey, leaving Matteo to navigate the heavy, unspoken sadness of the house alone. This year had to be different. He sat with Eliza and Matteo on the veranda, the place where so many of their new beginnings had taken root. "Next week," he began, his voice quiet, "is the anniversary of the day we lost your mother." Matteo grew very still. "I don't want it to be a sad day anymore," Marco continued, his voice full of a new, hard-won wisdom. "I want it to be a day where we remember her, with love." He looked at his son. "What do you think we should do?" Matteo was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant blue horizon. Then his hands and his new quiet voice worked together. "Can we visit her?" he asked. He had never been to her grave. The visit took place on a beautiful, clear spring morning. The cemetery was a peaceful green space on a hill overlooking the endless expanse of the ocean. The three of them walked hand in hand to the simple, elegant marble headstone that read, "Isabella Moretti, beloved wife and mother." They brought a bouquet of her favorite flowers, white lilies. Marco stood before the grave, a silent, grieving husband, lost in his own memories. It was Eliza who provided the strength, her hand a warm, steady presence in his, her other arm wrapped securely around Matteo's shoulders. After a long, quiet moment, Matteo stepped forward. He stood before his mother's grave, a small, brave soldier, and for the first time he told her his story. "Mommy," he began, his voice a little shaky but clear, his hands moving in concert with his words, a beautiful, dual-language eulogy. "I miss you." He told her about the long years of silence. And then he turned and gestured to Eliza. "I want you to meet someone. This is Eliza, she's my best friend. She taught my hands how to talk again, and my mouth too. She's going to be our family now." He looked back at the cold stone, his voice full of a simple, profound, and healing conviction. I think you would have loved her." The act of introduction, of formally and lovingly bridging his cherished past with his hopeful future, was the final, most important step in his own healing. Marco, listening to his son's incredible, mature grace, finally let go of the last of the guilt he had carried for 5 long years, a quiet, cleansing wave of tears rolling down his face. Matteo then took a single, perfect white lily from the bouquet and placed it at the base of the headstone. They stood there for a moment longer, not as a broken man and his new, fragile family, but as a single, whole, and unbreakable unit. Marco looked at his son, who had just honored his mother with more wisdom and love than he himself had ever been able to muster. He looked at Eliza, the incredible woman who had made it all possible, who had not just healed his son, but had healed him too. He finally understood that honoring his late wife's memory was not about preserving the past in a silent, grieving shrine. It's about building a future that is worthy of her love. 1 year later. The grand opening of the Daniel May Center for Communication was a festival of voices. The building, a masterpiece of light, warmth, and thoughtful design, buzzed with a joyous, chaotic, and beautiful energy. It was filled with the sound of children's laughter, the quiet, graceful dance of hands speaking in sign, and the excited chatter of parents who had, for the first time, found a place that understood the unique language of their own families. At the heart of the celebration was the family that had dreamed it into existence. Marco, no longer the intimidating don of a bygone era, moved through the crowd with the easy grace of a proud husband and benefactor, his presence a source of warmth, not fear. Eliza, the center's co-director, was in her element, a respected and beloved leader, signing with one child, speaking soft words of encouragement to a nervous parent, her compassion a tangible force. And Matteo, now a confident and articulate 11-year-old, was the day's guest of honor. He moved easily between his 2 languages, a natural and graceful bridge between the world of sound and the world of silence. The dedication ceremony was held in the center's beautiful, sun-drenched garden. Marco gave a brief, heartfelt speech about the power of second chances. Then, with a voice thick with a pride so profound it almost broke him, he introduced the keynote speaker, his son. Matteo walked to the podium, not with the hesitant steps of a boy, but with the steady confidence of a young man who has found his voice. He looked out at the crowd and smiled. He began his speech in silence. His hands, which had once been a source of frustration and shame, moved with a fluid, poetic grace. On the large screens on either side of the stage, his hands were projected for all to see. He signed about the loneliness of a world without words, of having a heart full of stories with no one to tell them to. Then, as his hands continued their silent dance, his voice, clear and strong, joined them, a beautiful, bilingual performance. "For a long time," he said and signed, "I lived in that quiet world, but I was one of the lucky ones. Someone came into my life who already knew my secret language. He looked at his mother, Eliza, his eyes full of a love that filled the entire garden. She taught me that every single person deserves to be heard, no matter how they speak. He then turned his gaze to his father. My mother, Eliza, taught me the language of the hands. And my father, Marco, he said, a brilliant smile on his face. He taught our whole home how to listen with their hearts. He looked back at the crowd, at all the other children. This place is for you, he finished, so you will always have a place to tell your story. So you will always have a voice. Later, after the ceremony, the three of them stood on a small balcony of the new center, looking down at the joyful crowd below. In the garden, a group of both hearing and non-hearing children were together, laughing as they taught each other simple signs. It's not a secret language anymore, is it? Matteo said, a quiet wonder in his voice. Eliza put her arm around his shoulders. No, sweet boy, she said, her own heart full. Now, it's a gift. Marco looked at his son, now a confident, articulate young leader. He looked at his wife, the quiet housekeeper, who had, with her profound and unwavering compassion, completely and irrevocably redeemed his entire world. He thought back to the man he used to be, a lonely king in a glass castle. His son, his silent, heartbroken prince. He knew now that true power was not in being feared or obeyed. True power was in the quiet, patient and revolutionary act of learning to understand. He took his wife's hand and rested his other on his son's shoulder. The journey that had begun with a single secret sign had come full circle, and its language was no longer a whisper. It was a joyful, powerful, and beautiful song, now being freely and generously shared with the world.